Hey guys, alright, picking up where we left off. Okay, so in 1966 we see the Newfoundland Act. This act is more concerned with fishing rights and appointment of jurisdiction than with the settlers. The charter gave the ship admirals governance of the land and the naval captains territorial jurisdiction over the land. This charter greatly favored the British fishing merchants. Settlement of Newfoundland was allowed as long as it did not interfere with migratory fishing. 30 years later, by 1729, we begin to see more settlement growth in Newfoundland. Settlement in Newfoundland was slow, the land was isolated, the weather was harsh, and the winters were long. The land had little potential for agriculture, and settlers had to import food. There was not much economic potential beyond fishing. There still really isn't. By the next year, the fisheries had expanded and the French were excluded from the vicinity by the Treaty of Utrech. The Treaty of Utrech helped end the War of the Spanish Succession, officialized France's loss of Acadia, France gave up Cape Breton to the British, and the French recognized Britain's claim to the Hudson's Bay territory. As colonization grew in Newfoundland, migratory fishing made less and less sense, and the fishermen became braver and braver and ventured further away from shore. The seigneurial system lasted about 50 years, between the years of 1663 and 1713. It was a system of land allocation, long thin strips of land along the St. Lawrence. This land belonged to the king but was maintained by the seigneurs, and the seigneurs divided the land to the habitants. The habitants had to maintain the land, pay taxes on the land to the seigneurs, and 3 days of the year had to work building roads. The strips of land were along the river to provide equal opportunity access to the water. The number of seigneuries was small. Very little land was cleared, and this was due to the heavy focus on staples. If an economy focuses too heavy on staples, it will develop slowly and is subject to the volatility of world tastes. And technically it falls into a staples trap, which we've mentioned a few times now. With slow clearance of land, the agriculture grew slowly in New France as well. New France had a short growing season, rocky and sandy land. It had drainage problems. Seigneurs provided the grain mills, but 90% of exports out of New France were still furs. Even though the majority of New France's inhabitants were farmers, fur was a great way to make money on the side. So technically when it was the off-season, or when fur trading was slow, they'd farm. So when it was the off-season for farming, they'd trap and trade fur. With the introduction of the credit system in the 1960s, it led to big corporation domination. With the surplus of fur from the high price, the price dropped back down. The problem with this was that trappers wanted to enjoy the inflated income, so instead of supplying less, they did the exact opposite. They decided to supply even more. This led to a 10-year supply in excess of fur in France. When France ordered the trading shacks to close, French trappers did not like this and began to trade with the British. In 1713 saw hardships for France and great victories for Britain. In 1713, France signed the Treaty of Utrech, which declared Britain's control over the Hudson's Bay Company. French are told to declare allegiance to Britain or leave Acadia, which meant the British got control of Acadia and France recognized Britain's claim over Newfoundland. The French began construction of Fort Louisbourg. Britain was kind of wary of this, but the French proved to only isolate themselves. With the Treaty of Utrech ending a long period of war, France finally saw their economy begin to expand. France's shipping increased, trade balance improved, Fort Louisbourg began trading with the West Indies, and forward linkages began to emerge, with the diversification out of the staple. Fort Louisbourg was a big market for New France's wood and lumber supplies, and the West Indies were after New France's grain and fish. Immigration to Louisbourg increased because of peace and urbanization of Quebec City, and Montreal began, which meant forward linkages. But when Acadia refused to swear allegiance to the British in 1745, things began to heat up again. As history tends to repeat itself, it did once more. With the spillover of the War of the Austrian Succession into North America, the British conquered the French in Canada. In 1755, the Acadians were expelled, and the British saw it very important to get rid of the French, and New Englanders moved into Acadia. So, Britain needed internal stability in former New France, and needed to win over the New France citizens. Britain tried a military government and reduced Quebec's borders, but it didn't work. With the Quebec Act in 1774, Quebec's borders were once again extended, and the French language was legitimized. In 1755, 1 year later, we also see the 6-Year War. The British wipe out the French as commercial rivals with the victory of Wolfe over Montcalm in the Plains of Abraham, and the French give up Montreal in 1760. By 1763, the French turned over New France to Britain with the Treaty of Paris. Britain also reduced Quebec's boundaries in hopes to gain stability over former New France citizens. In 1791, the Constitution Act split the St. Lawrence into Upper and Lower Canada. This was mainly because of differences in English and British language. Well, English and French language, sorry. And the differences between religious and legal systems. But with the British conquest in 1760 to 1802, the French merchants left and the British merchants saw a void that needed to be filled. With this, the French playing card system fell to pieces and the French garrisons were abandoned. In Lower Canada, the seigneurial system was abandoned and the land was now freehold. This is 1791. The road systems began to develop, and this meant less dependence on river systems, and the number of towns began to increase. The 1700s saw a lot of economic growth for the colonies due mainly to British expenditure. These expenditures were on army garrisons, housing troops, and supplying the garrisons. In the 1700s, Quebec had a wheat boom, but by 1809, Quebec was no longer exporting wheat. Some historians theorize that it was due to the wheat midge. Some say it was not an efficient allocation of Quebec's resources, and using the land for other purposes was more economic. And others say that Lower Canada could not compete with Upper Canada's wheat market. So we have 3 different theories on why Quebec stopped exporting wheat. We have the midge, the not opportune allocation of resources, and competition with Upper Canada. So Quebec became a large importer of wheat. Now forestry was next on the docket for staple export. Forestry was largely impacted by the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Sawmills were built near harbors because lumber was floated down streams as the primary way of transportation, and the sawmills used water power to turn the saws. Timber was harvested primarily for export, and the further away the lumber came from, the higher the costs. With constant periods of war, this created a demand for boats. The demand for timber went up in Europe primarily due to war. Also, large boats were needed to get to the West Indies, and the best shipbuilders were in Nova Scotia. The timber that was exported was cut square for stacking purposes, as timber was high bulk and low value and high transportation cost. Britain recognized the value of timber from Canada and imposed high duties and tariffs to keep that timber for their own navy. New Brunswick had lots of pine and spruce and lots of rivers. That meant that went into the interior. Even farmers switched to timber as it was so lucrative. But shipping lumber also created a demand for big ships to carry the lumber, so forward linkages were created. 50% of ships that were built in New Brunswick, in fact, went to Britain. Now, during the War of 1812, fur exports were down to only 10% of all exports, but timber exports were high, and this was because, as we said before, due to war. Lumbering mostly took place in the winters when farmers needed income. The farmers would leave their farms and camp in the winter and be mobile in the spring. Lower Canada always experienced immigration from the Irish and French, and after a long winter, they would come back to town and party it up. With partying came drinking, and with drinking came fights, and fights broke out all over the region. So this was where laws and language were important. The fights were mainly due to religion, the differences in laws, and differences in language. So since we had varying laws and language, a lot of fights broke out over that, and of course religion was big as well. Timber gave farmers part-time jobs and made seigneuries more valuable. Lower Canada was not doing well at the time. The wheat midge ravaged their crops, and remember, Lower Canada is actually north of where we are. So the wheat midge ravaged their crops, and there was vast hunger. The standard of living in Quebec fell, and the new generation had to make a decision whether to stay or leave. And so thousands of young left to New England in search of better life and higher living standards. Some left to Montreal for their more dynamic economy, and those who left and were fur traders settled in the Niagara and Kingston regions. By 1817, the first bank was established, and this is the Bank of Montreal. In 1815, Britain was dominating the economy, but timber was still not something steady enough to base the economy upon. Just as any other staple, the demand for timber was volatile. It had seasonal qualities and was linked to Britain's construction cycles. By 1816, the duties on timber became permanent, and Britain was encouraging buying colonial timber. 1816, Nova Scotia was pressuring Britain to send Navy ships to keep the U.S. ships from fishing off shores of Newfoundland. The U.S. responded to this in 1818 with the U.S. Navigation Act that closed all U.S. ports to British ships. Britain, in 1818, that same year, declared the British Freeport Act and kept British ports open to U.S. ships, so they did the exact opposite of what the U.S. did. So they did this because they could import goods from the U.S. and keep costs low. In 1830, when Newfoundland became an official British colony, there was an agreement of the U.S. and Britain opening ports back up to each other. In 1830, Nova Scotia had three distinct economic zones. The north was farming, the south was fishing, and the interior was lumber. All this creating two types of manufacturing. Forward and backward linkages and final demand linkages. The maritime economies turned out to be a product of the North American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and British mercantilism. So this brings us to the end of your review for your first midterm. I hope you all do well, and if you have watched these videos, attended classes, and made notes, there's no reason why everybody shouldn't do excellent. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me, and best of luck.